September 2019. The demolition crew working on the old Harrison farm in Millbrook County had seen plenty of abandoned properties in their careers, but something about this one felt different. The farmhouse had stood empty for nearly a decade, its fields gone to seed, its buildings slowly surrendering to time and weather. When the excavator's bucket struck something solid near the old barn, the crew assumed it was just another forgotten foundation. They were wrong. What they'd already found was a cistern, sealed with concrete that had aged to the color of bone. The foreman made a note in his logbook and almost moved on. But something gnawed at him. The seal was too deliberate, too careful. After 61 years of keeping it secret, the earth was finally ready to speak. Before we go further into this story, if you're fascinated by cases where time itself becomes part of the mystery, where answers lie buried beneath decades of silence, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Because what this sealed cistern revealed would finally explain a disappearance that had haunted a community since 1958. A mystery that began on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when a man simply vanished while plowing a field in broad daylight. This is the story of Michael Roberts. And this is the story of how the truth can wait 61 years to surface. Michael Roberts was the kind of man who understood land the way some people understand music. At 28 years old, he could read the soil like a book, knowing instinctively where it was rich and where it was tired, where water ran close to the surface and where the earth ran deep and dry. His hands were perpetually stained with the red clay of Millbrook County, Missouri, his fingernails carrying crescents of dirt that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. He wore the same battered straw hat every day, its brim darkened with sweat and shaped by countless summer suns. Those who worked alongside Michael described him as quiet but not unfriendly. He was a man of few words, letting his work speak for itself, and his work spoke volumes. When Michael Roberts tended a field, that field produced. He had a reputation for being the first one out at dawn and the last one to quit at dusk. His silhouette recognizable even from a distance by that distinctive hat and his methodical, unhurried way of moving through his tasks. He stood about 5'10", built solid and strong from years of physical labor. His face was weathered for his age, tanned deep by the sun, with smile lines around his eyes that appeared when he was amused, which, according to his wife Dorothy, was more often than people realized. He just smiled quietly, she would say, not like some people who needed everyone to know they found something funny. Michael had grown up on a farm 3 counties over, the youngest of 5 children. He'd learned to drive a tractor before he learned to drive a car, could repair an engine with whatever tools were at hand, and possessed that particular form of patience that only farming can teach, the understanding that some things simply cannot be rushed, that nature moves on its own schedule, and a good farmer learns to work with that rhythm rather than against it. His marriage to Dorothy Collins in 1955 had been the talk of Millbrook for weeks, not because it was scandalous, but because everyone agreed it was such a perfect match. Dorothy was a teacher's daughter, educated and proper, while Michael was the quiet farm worker who somehow won her heart with his steady reliability and his rare but genuine smiles. They'd met at a church social, where Dorothy later confessed she'd been charmed by how Michael actually listened when people spoke, rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. They rented a small house on the edge of town, painted yellow with white trim, with a garden that Dorothy tended and a front porch where they'd sit in the evenings. Michael had dreams of owning his own land someday. He kept a notebook where he'd written calculations, how much he needed to save, how many years it would take, what kind of farm he wanted to build. Dorothy would find this notebook years later, its pages filled with his careful handwriting, numbers added and re-added, dreams tallied up in dollars and cents. Michael worked primarily for the Harrison Farm, one of the largest properties in Millbrook County. Thomas Harrison was a third-generation landowner, a man in his 60s who'd inherited 200 acres of prime farmland and ran it with exacting standards. Michael had been working for Harrison for nearly 4 years by April 1958, and he'd proven himself reliable enough that Harrison trusted him with the most important tasks of the planting season. But there was something else that made Michael's relationship with the Harrison farm special. The 1953 Farmall tractor that Michael drove every day, the red International Harvester with the diesel engine, had become almost an extension of Michael himself. He'd maintained it meticulously, repaired it when it broke down, knew every quirk of its engine. And Harrison had made him a promise. When Harrison upgraded to newer equipment, Michael could buy the Farmall at a fair price. It was part of Michael's dream. Owning that tractor would be his first real step toward having his own farm. He'd even started a separate savings envelope, labeled Farmall Fund, in his careful handwriting, tucking away $5 or $10 whenever he could spare it. Those who knew Michael would tell you about his particular habits. He always checked his tractor twice before starting it for the day. He never smoked while working, saying it distracted him from paying attention to the land. He carried his lunch in the same dented metal pail every day, usually sandwiches Dorothy made, an apple, and a thermos of coffee that he'd drink cold by afternoon. He wore work boots that he'd resoled 3 times because, as he told Dorothy, they were finally broken in just right. On Sunday mornings, you could find Michael and Dorothy at the First Baptist Church, sitting in the same pew, 4th row from the front on the left side. Michael would hold the hymnal for both of them, his voice a quiet bass that never tried to stand out, but always stayed true to the melody. After church, they'd sometimes drive out to the county lake, where Michael would skip stones across the water, with the same patient precision he brought to everything else. He had a gentleness about him that made dogs trust him instantly and made children unafraid. The neighbor kids would sometimes watch him work, and he'd let them sit on the tractor for a moment, always making sure they were safe, always taking time to explain what the different levers did, even though he had work to finish. Dorothy would later say that Michael had been different in the weeks before he disappeared. Not obviously, but in small ways she noticed. He seemed preoccupied, troubled. In early April, he'd come home looking angry, which was rare for Michael. When she pressed him, he'd said that Harrison was going back on his word about something, but he wouldn't elaborate. "I'll handle it," he'd said. "A man's word should mean something." She'd seen him looking at the Farmall Fund envelope one evening, his jaw set in that way he got when he was disappointed, but trying not to show it. But he never brought his work, troubles home in his words, only in that occasional distant expression and that tightness around his eyes that suggested he was carrying something heavy. This was Michael Roberts, not a hero, not a villain. Just a 28-year-old man who worked hard, loved his wife, dreamed of his own land, and showed up every day to do what needed to be done. A man who trusted that promises meant something, that hard work would be rewarded, that the world operated with a basic fairness. A man whose disappearance would become the kind of mystery that defies explanation, the kind that transforms an ordinary person into a ghost story that parents would tell their children for decades. The kind of mystery that begins on a Tuesday afternoon in April, when everything seems normal, until the moment it isn't. April 15th, 1958, dawned clear and bright across Millbrook County. The temperature climbed steadily through the morning, reaching 72 degrees by noon. Perfect. Spring weather for field work. Michael Roberts had risen at his usual time, 5 in the morning, and Dorothy had made him breakfast while he dressed in his work clothes. Denim overalls over a gray cotton shirt, his rieseled boots, and that battered straw hat. "I'll be on the west field today," he told Dorothy as he kissed her goodbye at the door. "Harrison wants it ready for planting by Friday." It was the last conversation they would ever have. Michael arrived at the Harrison farm at 6:30. 2 other workers were already there, James Whitfield and Carlos Mendez, both of whom had worked the Harrison land for years. The 3 men shared coffee from a pot that Mrs. Harrison had left in the equipment shed, discussing the day's work ahead. According to both James and Carlos, Michael seemed quieter than usual that morning, but not upset. Just thoughtful, like he had something on his mind. He didn't mention any plans beyond the day's work. By 7:15, Michael had fired up the farmall. Tractor, his farmall, as he thought of it, the one he was saving to buy, and headed out to the west field. The farmall was a 1953 model, painted the distinctive International Harvester red, with a diesel engine that Michael had personally serviced the week before. It ran smoothly, and the plow attachment was freshly sharpened. Everything was in perfect working order. The west field was approximately 40 acres, rectangular in shape, bordered on one side by a tree line and on the other sides by split-rail fencing. It sat about half a mile from the main farmhouse, visible from the house but far enough away that conversation couldn't be heard. The field was flat, the soil rich and dark, perfect for the corn that Harrison planned to plant. James Whitfield, working the north pasture, reported seeing Michael on the tractor around 11 o'clock that morning. The distinctive red of the farmall was clearly visible, and James could see Michael's straw hat, see the methodical, back-and-forth pattern as Michael worked the rows. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. Thomas Harrison himself checked on Michael's progress at 2:45 in the afternoon. Harrison would later tell investigators that he'd driven out to the west field in his truck, wanting to see how much Michael had accomplished. He'd finished about 3/4 of the field, Harrison stated. "Good, steady work, just what I expected from Michael." He waved to me, and I waved back. I told him. It looked good, and he nodded. Then I drove back to the house. That was at 2:45. I'm certain of the time because I looked at my watch. This was the last confirmed sighting of Michael Roberts alive. At 3:30, Harrison drove back out to the west field to tell Michael he could quit for the day. The weather forecast called for rain the next day, and Harrison wanted Michael to help move equipment into the barn first thing in the morning instead. What he found stopped his heart. The farmall tractor sat in the middle of the field, its engine silent, but the metal still warm. The plow attachment was lowered, its blades buried in the soil mid-furrow. Michael's metal lunch pail sat on the tractor seat, unopened. His thermos was there too, still half full of coffee. The field was empty. Harrison stood by the tractor and called Michael's name. His voice echoed across the empty field. Nothing. He walked the immediate area, thinking perhaps Michael had gone to relieve himself behind the tree line or had walked back toward the farm buildings. But Michael's truck was still parked by the equipment shed. There was nowhere he would have walked to. Harrison checked the tractor thoroughly. The key was still in the ignition, turned to the off position. The fuel tank was 3/4 full. There was no sign of mechanical failure. No reason Michael would have had to abandon the machine. More disturbing still, there was no sign of struggle. The ground around the tractor showed nothing but tractor tracks and boot prints, presumably Michael's, but no indication of additional people, no scuff marks, no disturbance in the soil that would suggest any kind of confrontation. By 4 o'clock, Harrison had enlisted James and Carlos in a search of the farm property. The three men combed through every building: the barn, the equipment sheds, the old tobacco curing house, even the chicken coops. They walked the entire perimeter of the west field, examined the tree line, called Michael's name until their voices were hoarse. Nothing. At 5:30, Harrison called Sheriff Vernon Hastings. At 6 o'clock, Dorothy Roberts received the phone call that would shatter her world. Michael hadn't come home, and no one could find him. Dorothy arrived at the Harrison farm at 6:20, still wearing her house dress, her face pale with growing dread. "This isn't like him," she kept saying. "Michael doesn't just leave. He doesn't just disappear. Something's wrong. Something's terribly wrong." As the sun began to set that Tuesday evening, casting long shadows across the west field where the abandoned farmall sat silent, the first organized search began. Sheriff Hastings had called in deputies from 2 neighboring counties. Volunteers from the church arrived with flashlights and lanterns. Someone brought bloodhounds. The dogs were given Michael's scent from his jacket, which Dorothy had brought from home. The hounds tracked eagerly across the west field, circling the tractor several times, then moving in a direct line toward the cluster of farm buildings about 300 yards away. The dogs followed the scent past the barn, past the equipment shed, and then converged on an area near an old stone structure partially hidden by overgrown grass, an abandoned cistern that hadn't been used in decades. But there, the dogs became confused. They circled, whined, and despite repeated attempts by their handlers, couldn't pick up a trail beyond that point. The scent simply ended. What the searchers didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that earlier that afternoon, between 3:30 and 6 o'clock, while Harrison was organizing the search and making phone calls, he had done something else. The old cistern, 12 feet deep and 4 feet wide, now held a terrible secret. And in the fading light of that April evening, as Dorothy wept and volunteers called Michael's name into the darkness, Thomas Harrison had already begun planning how to seal that secret away forever. Night fell fully by 8:30. Car headlights and flashlight beams crisscrossed the Harrison property as nearly 75 people searched through the darkness. Someone found a work glove near the tree line, but it didn't belong to Michael. Someone else found a rusted horseshoe, decades old and irrelevant. Every discovery raised hopes. Every discovery led nowhere. Dorothy sat in the Harrison farmhouse kitchen, drinking coffee she didn't want, staring at nothing. Mrs. Harrison sat with her, trying to offer comfort, but not knowing what to say. What do you say when a man vanishes from an empty field in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon? By midnight, the search parties were exhausted, but refusing to quit. The temperature had dropped into the 50s, and dew was forming on the grass. Sheriff Hastings made the difficult decision to suspend the search until dawn, when they could see properly. No one wanted to stop, but stumbling around in the dark was becoming dangerous. As the searchers dispersed, many of them driving past the west field where the farmall tractor still sat exactly as Michael had left it, a silence settled over the Harrison farm. In the darkness near the barn, the old cistern sat undisturbed, its stone walls holding their secret. By dawn, that opening would be sealed. Thomas Harrison rose at 4 a.m. on Wednesday, April 16th. While the county slept before the search resumed, he worked quickly and quietly. He'd prepared everything the night before: bags of concrete mix stored in the barn, water from the pump, tools laid out. The cistern opening was 4 feet across. It would take several bags of concrete to seal it properly. to make it look like it had been sealed for years, like routine maintenance that no one would question. By 6 a.m., when the volunteer searchers began arriving again, the cistern was sealed with a smooth cap of wet concrete that Harrison had carefully textured to make it look weathered. He'd even scattered some dirt and old leaves across it. When Sheriff Hastings and his deputies arrived, Harrison was standing with the volunteers, looking exhausted and worried, playing the role of the concerned employer whose trusted worker had mysteriously vanished. The bloodhounds were brought back in the daylight. Handlers tried again to track Michael's scent. The dogs led searchers to the same area near the barn, but now the scent trail ended at a different point, confused by the fresh concrete smell and Harrison's activity in the area. The handlers assumed the dogs were simply having an off day. It happens sometimes, they explained to Sheriff Hastings. Scent trails can be unpredictable, especially after 12 hours have passed. No one thought to check the sealed cistern. Why would they? It looked like it had been sealed for years. The search continued through Wednesday, with more than 200 volunteers organized into grid search teams. They expanded beyond the Harrison farm to neighboring properties, the woods that bordered the county road, even the creek bed 3/4 of a mile away. They found nothing. Sheriff Hastings interviewed everyone who'd been at the Harrison farm on Tuesday. James Whitfield repeated his statement about seeing Michael on the tractor at 11 a.m. Carlos Mendez confirmed that Michael had seemed normal that morning, maybe a bit quiet, but not upset or acting strangely. Thomas Harrison went through his timeline again, seeing Michael at 2:45, finding the abandoned tractor at 3:30. Mrs. Harrison stated she'd been in the farmhouse all day and hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. The investigation began exploring theories, each one more troubling than the last. Theory 1. Voluntary disappearance. Had Michael simply walked away from his life? Sheriff Hastings drove to the Roberts rental house with Dorothy to conduct a thorough check. Every single one of Michael's possessions was exactly where it should be. His other pair of boots sat by the door. His Sunday clothes hung in the closet. The notebook with his savings calculations sat on the kitchen table, opened to a page where he'd been figuring out loan payments for purchasing land. His wallet, containing his driver's license and $17, was in the drawer of the bedside table. The Farm All Fund envelope with its carefully saved $93 sat in the drawer beneath his work shirts. The only things missing were the clothes he'd been wearing and his work hat. A man planning to disappear takes his wallet, Sheriff Hastings said quietly to his deputy. He takes money. He takes his savings. He takes something. There was nothing about the scene that suggested Michael Roberts had planned to vanish. Theory 2. Accident or injury. Search teams scoured every inch of the Harrison property, looking for any place Michael could have fallen, been injured, or become trapped. They checked every well, every ravine, every drainage ditch. Volunteers waded through the creek. They searched the woods with poles, probing into thick undergrowth. The county's volunteer fire department arrived with specialized equipment to check structures on the property. They found nothing. No blood, no torn clothing, no sign that Michael had been injured anywhere on the farm. One deputy even noted the sealed cistern near the barn during the structural survey. Harrison explained it had been sealed years ago for safety reasons, standard practice for old cisterns that were no longer in use. The deputy noted it in his report and moved on. The concrete looked old, weathered. There was no reason to question it. Theory 3. Foul play. This was the theory that Sheriff Hastings kept returning to, though he had no evidence to support it. The abandonment of the tractor mid-furrow suggested something sudden. The lunch pail left unopened suggested Michael hadn't stopped for his normal break. The warm engine suggested he'd been there recently when Harrison arrived at 3:30. But there was no sign of struggle, no indication of any other person being present. If someone had harmed Michael and removed his body, they'd done so without leaving a single trace. Hastings expanded his investigation to look at Michael's recent activities. Had he had any conflicts with anyone? Any debts? Any enemies? Every inquiry came back negative. Michael Roberts was universally described as quiet, reliable, and liked by everyone who knew him. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't fight. He went to work, came home to his wife, went to church on Sundays. He was, by all accounts, the last person anyone expected to be at the center of a mystery. One potential lead emerged on Thursday, April 17th. A farmer named Eugene Pritchard, whose property bordered the Harrison farm to the east, reported that he'd seen an unfamiliar blue sedan on the county road near the Harrison property on Tuesday afternoon. He couldn't remember exactly what time, just sometime afternoon. He hadn't paid much attention because cars drove that road regularly. He couldn't describe the driver or provide a license plate number. Sheriff Hastings followed up extensively, but the lead went nowhere. Dozens of blue sedans were registered in the county, and there was no way to determine if the car Pritchard had seen had any connection to Michael's disappearance. Dorothy Roberts was staying with her sister in town, unable to bear being alone in the yellow house she'd shared with Michael. Sheriff Hastings had to deliver unexpected news to her on Friday, April 25th, 10 days after Michael's disappearance. "Mrs. Roberts," he said gently, "the doctor wanted me to tell you, you're pregnant." The county doctor had examined Dorothy at her sister's insistence. She'd been pale, exhausted, nauseated, overwhelmed. The pregnancy test was positive. Dorothy was approximately 6 to 8 weeks along. She would later say that the news broke something inside her, completely. Michael had wanted children so badly. They'd been trying for over 2 years. And now, when it had finally happened, he wasn't there to know. He might never know. The investigation continued through the 3rd week of April, then into May. The FBI was consulted. They had no jurisdiction since there was no evidence of kidnapping or interstate flight, but they reviewed the case and offered suggestions. Hastings followed everyone. Investigators interviewed everyone who'd worked at the Harrison farm in the past 5 years. They looked into Thomas Harrison's finances, wondering if there had been some dispute over wages. The books appeared clean. Harrison paid his workers fairly and on time, though the farm was carrying significant debt, which wasn't unusual for agricultural operations. As the search entered its 6th week, the reality began to settle in. Michael Roberts had vanished completely, impossibly, from an open field in the middle of a spring afternoon. There was no body, no evidence of where he'd gone or what had happened to him. No trace. The community began to whisper, the way communities do when confronted with something they cannot explain. Some people began suggesting that Michael had run off, that his reliable, steady persona had been an act, that he'd been planning his disappearance all along. Dorothy heard these whispers, and they wounded her deeply. She knew her husband. She knew he hadn't left willingly. But as spring turned to summer and no new leads emerged, even Sheriff Vernon Hastings had to admit defeat. On June 2nd, 1958, he held a final meeting with Dorothy Roberts in his office. Dorothy was showing now, about 4 months pregnant, her face hollowed by grief and stress. "Mrs. Roberts," Hastings said, his voice heavy with failure, "we've done everything we can. Without new evidence, without any kind of lead, there's nowhere else to look. We're not closing the case officially, but we have to scale back the active." Investigation. Dorothy, one hand resting protectively on her growing belly, simply nodded. "He's still out there," she whispered. "Somewhere. He wouldn't leave me. He wouldn't leave his child. Something happened to him. Someone knows what happened." She was right. Someone did know. And 12 feet beneath the surface of the Harrison farm, sealed under concrete that was already beginning to weather and blend with its surroundings, Michael Roberts lay in the darkness, waiting for time to tell his story. But if someone knew, they weren't talking. The Harrison farm returned to normal operations. The west field was planted with corn that grew tall and straight. The farm-all tractor, the tractor Michael had dreamed of owning, was sold to a farmer in the next county for $850, money that helped Harrison pay down some of his mounting debts. Life went on, the way it always does, even when the inexplicable remains unexplained. Michael Roberts was gone, and the world offered no answers. On August 12, 1958, Dorothy Roberts gave birth to a daughter at Millbrook County Hospital. She named her Sarah, after Michael's mother. The baby was healthy, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same deep brown as her father's. Dorothy held her daughter and wept because Michael would never hold her, would never see her first smile, would never teach her to skip stones at the county lake. Sarah Roberts grew up with a ghost for a father. His photograph hung in the living room of the yellow house, Michael in his Sunday clothes, looking serious and steady, the way he'd looked in 1957 when they'd had the portrait taken at the church directory session. Dorothy told Sarah stories about him every night. "Your daddy was the most reliable man I ever knew," she would say. "He never broke a promise. He always kept his word. He was saving up to buy his own farm, saving up to buy the tractor he loved. He had dreams for us, for you." But as Sarah grew older, she began hearing other stories. In school, the other children would whisper. "Her dad ran away," they'd say. "He left because he didn't want a baby." Sarah would come home crying, and Dorothy would hold her and tell her it wasn't true. It would never be true. But the doubt had been planted. If he hadn't left, where was he? Why couldn't anyone find him? The mystery of Michael Roberts became part of Millbrook County folklore. The case remained, officially open, but inactive. Sheriff Hastings retired in 1965, still haunted by his failure to solve the disappearance. His successor, Sheriff Daniel Morrison, inherited the Michael Roberts file and occasionally reviewed it. But there was nothing new to investigate, no leads to follow. The case became the kind of story people told at dinner parties or late at night around campfires. "Did you hear about the farm worker who vanished into thin air?" they'd say, and the story would be retold, embellished, transformed from tragedy to legend. The Harrison farm changed hands in 1972. Thomas Harrison died of a heart attack in March of that year at age 76. Whatever secrets he carried went with him to the grave. His widow sold the property within 3 months to a family from Kansas City who wanted to try gentleman farming. They lasted 5 years before selling to a corporate agricultural company that worked the land for another decade. Each new owner would hear the story of Michael Roberts, the man who'd disappeared from the West Field. And each time the story was told, small details would shift, change, become unreliable. Some versions had Michael fighting with Harrison. Others had him involved with another woman. None of these variations were true, but the truth had become slippery with time, harder to hold on to as the years passed. The sealed cistern near the barn remained undisturbed through all these ownership changes. It was noted in property surveys as old cistern, sealed, and given no special attention. It was just another relic of the farm's past, one of dozens of old structures and features that dotted the property. The concrete cap weathered naturally, covered with moss in places, surrounded by grass and weeds. It looked exactly like what Harrison had claimed it was, an old safety hazard that had been properly sealed decades ago. Dorothy never remarried. She continued living in the yellow house, working as a seamstress to support herself and Sarah. She refused to have Michael declared legally dead, even though it would have made financial matters easier. "I don't know that he's dead," she'd say stubbornly. "Until someone shows me proof, I won't accept it." Her entire life became a vigil, a long waiting for answers that never came. In 1959, Dorothy had filed a wrongful death claim against the Harrison estate, seeking compensation for Michael's presumed death while working on Harrison's property. Harrison's lawyers fought it vigorously, arguing that there was no evidence Michael had died on the farm, no proof of what had happened to him. The case dragged through the courts for 2 years before being dismissed in 1961. Without a body, without evidence of death, the court ruled there was no basis for the claim. Harrison had testified under oath that he knew nothing about Michael's disappearance, that he'd been as shocked and confused as everyone else. The judge had no choice but to rule in Harrison's favor. Dorothy received that verdict in the mail on a Tuesday in November 1961. She sat at her kitchen table and cried, not just for the lost compensation that would have helped her raise Sarah, but for what the verdict seemed to say: that Michael's life, his disappearance, his loss, meant nothing. That there would be no justice, no answers, no resolution. Sarah Roberts left Millbrook County in 1976, going to college in St. Louis. She rarely came back to visit. The town held too many painful associations, too many questions about her father that she couldn't answer. She became a librarian, married a kind man named Robert Chen, and had 2 children of her own. She tried to move forward with her life, tried not to think about the father she'd never known. But the mystery haunted her too. On quiet nights, she'd find herself wondering, what happened? Where did he go? Did he suffer? Did he think of her? Of the baby he never got to meet? Dorothy Roberts died in December 2015, at the age of 84. She'd lived 57 years without knowing what happened to her husband. The obituary in the Millbrook County Register mentioned her as the widow of Michael Roberts, who disappeared in 1958 and was never found. She was buried in the First Baptist Church Cemetery, with Michael's name engraved on the headstone next to hers, though no body rested there. It was a memorial to a man who'd become a mystery, a name without a grave. Until her last breath, Dorothy believed that Michael hadn't left her. "He's waiting for me," she told Sarah in her final days. "Wherever he is, he's waiting, and I'll find him again." It was the faith that had sustained her through 5 decades of unanswered questions. The Harrison farm property changed hands again in 2008, purchased by a development company that planned to subdivide it for residential housing. Those plans fell through during the recession, and the property sat vacant for over a decade. The farmhouse deteriorated, its roof collapsing in places, its windows broken by vandals or weather. The barn remained standing but rotting. The fields went wild, reclaimed by native prairie grass and invasive honeysuckle. The farm buildings that Michael Roberts had known so well became ruins, slowly returning to the earth. The west field, where Michael had last been seen, was now nearly invisible beneath years of accumulated vegetation. The split-rail fences had collapsed. The tree line had expanded, reclaiming land that had once been cultivated. If you'd stood in that field in 2018, you wouldn't have known it had once been plowed land, wouldn't have guessed that a man had vanished there 60 years before. Nature had written over the story, covered it with new growth, buried it beneath seasons of leaves and snow and rain. The sealed cistern, too, had been claimed by time. Vines grew over it. Grass surrounded it. The barn that had once stood nearby was now partially collapsed, its old timber leaning at dangerous angles. The entire property had become a forgotten place, a relic waiting for demolition or renewal. But some secrets don't stay buried forever. September 17th, 2019. The demolition company hired to clear the Harrison property had been working for 3 days when crew chief Marcus Webb noticed the anomaly. His excavator had been clearing away the collapsed barn when the bucket struck something solid and unyielding. Webb climbed down to investigate, expecting to find an old foundation or perhaps a filled-in well. What he found was a circular structure, approximately 4 feet in diameter, made of mortared stone and sealed at the top with concrete that had aged to a pale gray. The seal was smooth, deliberate, clearly man-made. The stone cistern itself was typical of rural Missouri farms from the early 1900s. Many properties had them for collecting. Rainwater before rural electrification made well pumps practical. Most had been filled in or simply abandoned decades ago, but this one had been sealed. Carefully, purposefully sealed with poured concrete. Webb, a 30-year veteran of demolition work, felt his instincts trigger. Something about it felt wrong, he would later tell reporters. Most old cisterns were either left open or just had boards thrown over them. This one was sealed like someone was trying to make absolutely sure it stayed closed, like they were hiding something. He called his supervisor, who called the property owner, who made the decision to open it. "We need to know what's down there before we can proceed with demolition," the owner explained. "Could be environmental contamination, could be structural issues, could be anything. We need to check it out." On September 19th, 2019, a contractor with concrete cutting equipment carefully removed the seal from the top of the cistern. The raw concrete was approximately 6 inches thick and had been poured decades earlier. The aggregate and composition were consistent with concrete mixes used in the 1950s, according to the contractor. The concrete had weathered on top, but underneath, where it met the stone, it was still solid and intact. Once the seal was removed, the opening revealed darkness and a smell like old stone, stagnant water, and something else, something organic and ancient. Webb dropped a weighted line into the cistern to measure the depth. The line went down 12 feet before hitting bottom. He shined a high-powered flashlight down into the darkness and saw bones. "I knew immediately what I was looking at," Webb said later. "I've been alive long enough to know a human skeleton when I see one. The skull was right there, looking up at me through 60 years of darkness. I backed away from that cistern and called 911 immediately. My hands were shaking." Sheriff Rebecca Torres, Sheriff Daniel Morrison's successor, arrived at the scene with her forensic team within 40 minutes. She'd been sheriff for 6 years, having won election in 2013, and had handled her share of difficult cases. But nothing had prepared her for this. She secured the area, cordoned it off with police tape, and called in the state medical examiner. Dr. Patricia Hammond arrived from Jefferson City the next morning, September 20th, along with a team of forensic anthropologists from the state crime lab. The recovery operation took 3 days. The cistern was 12 feet deep, but accumulated silt and debris over the decades had created a layer of sediment about 3 feet deep at the bottom. The skeletal remains were found at the very bottom, positioned in a way that suggested the body had been dropped or placed there rather than fallen accidentally. The skeleton was lying on its back, one arm bent awkwardly beneath the torso, the other extended. The skull showed clear trauma. Dr. Hammond's preliminary assessment, delivered at the scene, confirmed that the remains were human, male, and had been in the cistern for an extended period. Decades, not years. The skeleton was largely intact, though some smaller bones had been scattered by water seepage and time. Most significantly, there was a clear fracture to the right posterior parietal bone of the skull, a depressed fracture approximately 2 inches in diameter, consistent with a single blow from a heavy, blunt object. This was not an accident, Dr. Hammond stated clearly. The position of the body, the deliberate sealing of the cistern, and the nature of the skull fracture all point to homicide. Someone killed this person, put them in this cistern, and sealed it with concrete. This was concealment of a crime, but identifying the remains would require more extensive testing. The forensic team carefully removed every bone, every scrap of fabric, every possible piece of evidence from the cistern. Among the remains, they found fragments of denim fabric, consistent with work overalls, the fabric deteriorated but still identifiable, remnants of leather work boots, the soles badly deteriorated, but the leather upper portions partially preserved by the cistern's conditions. 3 metal buttons consistent with 1950s work shirt design, still bearing traces of gray thread. A corroded metal belt buckle with a simple rectangular design. No wallet, no identification, no personal effects that would have contained paper or photographs. It was the boots that first triggered Sheriff Torres's memory. She'd grown up in Millbrook County. Her grandfather had been a volunteer in the 1958 search for Michael Roberts. She'd heard the stories her entire life. The man who vanished from a field, the mystery that was never solved, the wife who died without answers. She went back to the station and pulled the file on Michael Roberts, a file that hadn't been opened in over a decade, its pages yellowed with age. The description of what Michael had been wearing on April 15, 1958, denim overalls, gray cotton work shirt, leather work boots that had been resoled multiple times. The file included measurements from the missing person report. Michael was approximately 5'10", weighed around 170 pounds. The skeletal remains measured 5'9" from heel to crown, within the normal margin of variation accounting for cartilage decomposition and measurement methods. The age range determined by the forensic anthropologist, late 20s to early 30s, matched Michael's age of 28 in 1958. Sheriff Torres pulled out a map of the Harrison farm from the 1958 investigation file. The cistern location was marked on the map. It had been noted during the property search, but the deputy's notation simply said, "Sealed cistern. Old." No one had thought to check inside it because it appeared to have been sealed for years. But what if it had been sealed days, not years, before the search? What if someone had sealed it while searchers were looking elsewhere, and then let it weather naturally until it looked ancient? Torres contacted Sarah Roberts Chen, now 61 years old and living in Chicago. The phone call was one of the most difficult of Torres's career. "Ms. Chen," Torres said carefully, "my name is Sheriff Rebecca Torres from Millbrook County, Missouri. I'm calling about your father, Michael Roberts. We may have found him. We've discovered human remains on the old Harrison farm property, and the circumstances strongly suggest they could be your father's. We're going to need a DNA sample from you to confirm the identification." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Sarah's voice breaking, "After 61 years? You found my father? Sarah took the next flight to Missouri. The DNA testing took 2 weeks. Buckle swab samples from Sarah compared against DNA extracted from the skeletal remains, teeth, and femur bone. The state laboratory expedited the testing, understanding the significance of potentially solving a 61-year-old mystery. The results came back on October 7, 2019. Match probability, 99.97%. The remains in the cistern were Michael Roberts. After 61 years, 4 months, and 22 days, Michael had been found. Not in a distant city living a new life. Not in an Ebitutes accidental grave in some remote location, but on the same property where he'd last been seen, sealed beneath concrete, hidden 12 feet below the surface, buried there within hours of his death in the spring of 1958. The press conference Sheriff Torres held on October 8th made national news. The story had everything. A decades-old mystery finally solved. The devoted wife who'd died without answers just 4 years earlier. The daughter who'd grown up without a father and had finally received confirmation of what her mother had always known. Michael Roberts hadn't left them. He'd been taken from them, but more than that, it was the nature of the discovery that captured public attention. Michael Roberts hadn't disappeared. He'd been murdered and hidden, and someone had sealed that cistern with concrete within days of his death, while hundreds of people searched for him, while his pregnant wife waited desperately for news. Someone had looked Dorothy Roberts in the eye at the Harrison farmhouse that terrible week, and pretended to be concerned, pretended to be helpful, all while knowing exactly where Michael was. The question that had haunted Millbrook County for 61 years had been answered. Michael Roberts hadn't vanished into thin air. He was right there all along, 12 feet beneath the surface, sealed in stone and concrete, waiting 61 years for someone to find him, waiting for time to tell his story. After 61 years, time finally did. And Dorothy, who never stopped believing, who never gave up faith that Michael hadn't left her, Dorothy was right all along. The forensic investigation into Michael Roberts' death moved swiftly once his identity was confirmed. Dr. Patricia Hammond's detailed autopsy report, released in November 2019, provided crucial insights into what had happened on that April day in 1958. The skull fracture was the key finding. The blow had struck the right posterior parietal bone, creating a depressed fracture approximately 2 inches in diameter. The force required to create such a fracture indicated a heavy, blunt object, possibly a large wrench, a hammer, or a piece of farm equipment. The angle of the blow suggested it had been delivered from behind and slightly to the right, catching Michael completely off guard. There was a small secondary fracture line extending from the main impact site, indicating the tremendous force involved. Death would have been nearly instantaneous, or at most, within minutes. The trauma to the brain would have caused immediate loss of consciousness. There were no defensive wounds on the arm bones, no other fractures, no signs that Michael had raised his hands to protect himself or struggled with an attacker. He'd been struck from behind without warning, never knowing what was coming. This was a targeted, deliberate act, Dr. Hammond concluded in her report. The victim was struck from behind with considerable force by someone who either knew him well enough to approach without raising suspicion or caught him while he was completely focused on his work. Given the location of the body and the circumstances, this appears to have been a crime of opportunity that was then carefully concealed. The timeline of concealment became clearer through historical research and forensic analysis. Sheriff Torres and her team obtained the original farm records from the Harrison property, which had been preserved in county archives. The farm ledger from 1958 showed normal operational notes through April 14th. Then, on April 18th, 1958, just 3 days after Michael disappeared, Thomas Harrison had made a notation. Cistern repairs completed. Materials: 8 bags concrete, sand, gravel. $40.22. The entry was brief, seemingly routine, the kind of maintenance notation that filled farm ledgers. But the timing was damning. The cistern had been sealed, while the entire county was searching for Michael Roberts. While Dorothy was waiting desperately for news. While volunteers were combing the woods and fields. The cistern had been sealed, and no one had thought to check it, because it looked like it had been sealed for years. But forensic analysis of the concrete told a different story. The composition was consistent with 1950s concrete mix, but more specifically, the weathering patterns and microscopic analysis suggested the concrete had been poured in mid-April 1958, exactly when the ledger said it had been. Harrison hadn't lied about when he sealed it. He'd simply lied about why. The investigation turned to Thomas Harrison, though the man himself was 47 years beyond justice, having died in 1972. Torres's team interviewed everyone still living who'd known Harrison, piecing together a picture of the man who'd employed Michael Roberts. What emerged was troubling. Harrison's financial records from 1958, obtained through estate documents and bank archives, revealed that he'd been facing significant financial pressure. The farm was heavily mortgaged. Harrison owed $18,000 on the property, a substantial sum in 1958. Several equipment loans were coming due, and the bank had sent 2 letters in March 1958 warning about late payments. Harrison had taken out a substantial insurance policy on the farm property, and equipment in January 1958, just 3 months before Michael disappeared. The policy included liability coverage that would pay out in case of accidents or incidents on the property. More revealing still, Torres discovered correspondence between Harrison and a farm equipment dealer in Kansas City. In early April 1958, Harrison had agreed to sell the 1953 Farmall tractor, the one Michael drove, the one Michael was saving to buy, to another farmer for $850. The sale was scheduled for April 20th, 1958, just 5 days after Michael disappeared. This directly contradicted the promise Harrison had made to Michael. According to Dorothy's statement from 1958, which Torres reviewed, Michael had mentioned in early April that Harrison was going back on his word about something. James Whitfield, the former farm worker, now 87 years old, provided the crucial context when Torres interviewed him in the nursing home. Michael had a gentleman's agreement with Mr. Harrison, Whitfield said, his voice thin, but his memory surprisingly clear. Harrison had promised Michael he could buy that Farmall when Harrison upgraded equipment. Michael had been saving for it, we all knew that. But that spring, Harrison found someone willing to pay more money, and he was going to sell it to them instead. Michael was angry about it. I remember him saying, "A man's word should mean something." I told him to let it go, that it was just a tractor. But Michael was one of those people who believed in honor, you know? He believed promises mattered. Carlos Mendez, now 79 and retired in Arizona, confirmed the story when Torres tracked him down. There was tension between them that last week, Mendez recalled. Michael didn't yell or anything. That wasn't his way. But you could see he was upset. I think he probably confronted Harrison about it. Michael was saving every penny to buy his own land someday, and that tractor was supposed to be his first real step toward that dream. Having it sold out from under him after he'd been promised it, that would have hurt. The theory that emerged from the investigation was this. On April 15, 1958, sometime between 2:45 p.m. when Harrison saw Michael working, and 3:30 p.m. when Harrison discovered the abandoned tractor, there was a confrontation. Perhaps Michael had said something about the broken promise. Perhaps he'd threatened to quit, or to tell others in the community that Harrison's word couldn't be trusted. A serious reputation damage in a small farming community where trust and handshake deals were everything. Harrison, already under severe financial stress, facing the potential loss of his farm, may have lost his temper. There were heavy tools everywhere on a farm: wrenches, hammers, pieces of equipment. A moment of rage, a heavy object swung in anger, and Michael Roberts fell to the ground, dead or dying. Finding himself with a dead employee on his property in the middle of the afternoon, Harrison faced a choice: call the sheriff and face a murder investigation, manslaughter at minimum, possibly murder, or hide the body and hope Michael would be presumed to have run away. Harrison chose concealment. The old cistern was nearby, unused, deep. He likely dragged or carried Michael's body to the cistern. At 12 feet deep and 4 feet wide, it was a ready-made grave. He dropped the body into the darkness, then returned to the west field, turned off the tractor, arranged things to look like Michael had simply walked away mid-work. When he discovered the abandoned tractor at 3:30 p.m., his surprise was an act. His calls for help, his organization of the search, all theater. And during the chaos of the first search efforts, while volunteers were focused on the fields and woods, Harrison worked quickly. He may have covered the cistern temporarily that first night with boards or a tarp. Then, during the early morning hours of April 16th, while the county slept before the dawn search resumed, he mixed concrete and sealed the cistern permanently. The farm ledger notation on April 18th was his insurance. If anyone ever questioned the sealed cistern, he had a dated record showing it was routine maintenance. The concrete would weather quickly in Missouri's climate, and within months it would look like it had been there for years. It was a calculated, cold-blooded cover-up. And it worked for 61 years. Could the theory be proven beyond reasonable doubt? Not definitively. Harrison was long dead. There were no witnesses to the actual murder, no confession, no direct physical evidence linking Harrison to the crime beyond the circumstantial connections and the suspicious timing of the cistern being sealed. In the eyes of the law, the case remained technically unsolved, even though every piece of evidence pointed to Thomas Harrison as the killer. Dorothy Roberts had been right in her 1959 wrongful death lawsuit. Michael had died on the Harrison farm while working for Harrison, but without evidence, without a body, the case had been dismissed. If only the investigation in 1958 had been more thorough. If only someone had thought to check inside sealed structures. If only the bloodhound's confusion near the cistern area had been taken as a sign to search more carefully. But hindsight offers no comfort to those who suffered. Dorothy Roberts lived 57 years believing her husband might still be alive somewhere, hoping against hope that he'd come back. She died without ever knowing that Michael had been on that farm all along, 12 feet beneath the surface, as close to the farmhouse where she'd waited for news as the barn was to the west field. For Sarah Roberts Chen, standing at her father's grave in December 2019 for the reburial ceremony, the Baibida answers brought both relief and renewed grief. "I finally know what happened," she told the gathered mourners, which included her own children, Michael's grandchildren, who would never know him. "My mother died believing my father wouldn't have left us. She was right. He never left. He was taken from us. He was murdered and he was hidden, and the man who did it went to his grave without ever facing justice for what he'd done." Sarah had brought something to the burial service. The Farmel Fund, envelope carefully preserved for 61 years, still containing $93 in old bills. "This was his dream," she said quietly, placing the envelope in the casket before it was closed. "He died for this dream, for the principle that a man's word should mean something. I want him to have it now." Michael Roberts was laid to rest in the First Baptist Church Cemetery on December 15, 2019, 61 years and 8 months after his death. His casket was placed in the plot next to Dorothy's grave, their headstones now side by side as they should have been decades earlier. The memorial stone that had borne only Michael's name was replaced with one that carried the accurate dates: Michael James Roberts, 1930 to 1958. Beloved husband. Devoted father. Finally home. The case technically remains open in the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department files. Sheriff Rebecca Torres submitted her full investigative report to the district attorney's office, carefully documenting every piece of evidence, every interview, every conclusion. But no charges would ever be filed. The Missouri Statute of Limitations for murder doesn't apply. Murder can be prosecuted no matter how much time has passed. But you can't prosecute a dead man. Thomas Harrison took his secret to his grave in 1972, probably believing it would stay buried forever. The Harrison farm property was eventually sold to a conservation trust that turned it into a nature preserve, the Harrison Farm Historical Site. The cistern that served as Michael's tomb for 61 years was filled with clean earth and marked with a bronze plaque mounted on a stone base. In memory of Michael James Roberts, 1930 to 1958. Farm worker, husband, father. His life was taken, and his body was hidden here for 61 years. May his memory remind us that truth, though buried, will always surface. A man's word should mean something. The Morbant West Field, where Michael last worked, has been left to return to natural prairie. The Farmall tractor that Michael had loved and hoped to own, that may have been the catalyst for his murder, was sold by Harrison's estate in 1972. Through careful research, Torres's team tracked it down. It's now owned by a vintage tractor collector in Iowa, fully restored and displayed at agricultural shows. When the collector learned the tractor's connection to Michael Roberts' story, he placed a small plaque on it. Once driven by Michael Roberts, 1954 to 1958. The case of Michael Roberts reminds us that disappearances are rarely as mysterious as they seem. Someone always knows what happened. Evidence always exists somewhere if you know where to look and have the patience to search. The sealed cistern had been visible, documented on property surveys, noted in farm records, right there on the property for over 6 decades, but without reason to suspect it, without cause to check beneath the seal. It remained unexamined, a silent grave that held its secret, until time and circumstance finally broke it open. What remains unexplained? Why Harrison didn't simply report an accident. Farm accidents were tragically common in 1958. A tractor rollover, a fall, a piece of equipment malfunction. An unfortunate death during work might have been investigated and closed without criminal charges, especially if Harrison had crafted a plausible accident scenario. The choice to conceal suggests either that the nature of Michael's head wound was so clearly deliberate that it couldn't be explained as an accident, or that Harrison panicked in the moment and made an irrational choice that he then had to follow through with. We'll never know which. What also remains troubling is the realization that if the demolition company hadn't been hired in 2019, if the farm had simply been left abandoned for another decade or two, Michael Roberts might never have been found. The buildings would eventually have collapsed completely. The cistern would have been buried under vegetation and debris, and the secret would have been lost forever. But time had other plans, and perhaps there's some justice in that, in the fact that the Earth itself eventually gave up its secret, that the concealment Harrison thought was permanent proved to be temporary after all. What's certain is this: Michael Roberts didn't run away. He didn't abandon his pregnant wife. He didn't leave his dreams of owning his own land or his hopes of buying the farmall tractor he'd loved. He simply had the misfortune of working for a desperate, dishonest man on a spring Tuesday in 1958. And he had the integrity to stand up for principle, to believe that a man's word should mean something. And he paid for it with his life. In Millbrook County, Missouri, the story of Michael Roberts has transformed from unsolved mystery to painful truth. The man who vanished from the field didn't vanish at all. He was right there all along, 12 feet beneath the surface, sealed in stone and concrete, waiting 61 years for someone to find him, waiting for time to tell his story. After 61 years, time finally did. And Dorothy, who never stopped believing, who never gave up faith that Michael hadn't left her, Dorothy was right all along.